So welcome everyone to the November Coffee and Conversations. It's a monthly discussion series jointly organized by UNH's Carsey School of Public Policy, the State of New Hampshire Bureau of Education and Training, and the New Hampshire Association of Certified Public Managers to engage public service professionals in learning, problem solving, and collaboration. My name is UC Terrell, and I work with the Carsey School's Center for Impact Finance. We are pleased today to have two speakers talking about a very important, though frequently overlooked, part of society and the vulnerabilities in our New Hampshire community. We have Meg Chant and Bryan Bessette talking to us today about human trafficking and labor exploitation, particularly in New Hampshire. Meg is program director at the New Hampshire Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence, and in this role brings strategic oversight for the coalition's programming with a particular focus on prevention, human trafficking, and the sexual assault nurse examiners program. Meg brings together backgrounds in criminal justice and in refugees and asylum seekers, so really a combination as we see in human trafficking and labor exploitation, both at the criminal and the stick side of this, and also the compassion towards a victim-centered approach. Bryan Bessette also has been working in this field for many years. He's co-founder and executive director of the Freedom Cafe, which is a nonprofit based in Durham, which works to combat human trafficking through community engagement, education, and a simple pathway to fun work necessary for a traffic-free world. I'll turn it over to Meg and Bryan to tell us about human trafficking, labor exploitation in New Hampshire. Please feel free at any point to interrupt with questions or to put your comments and questions in the chat, and I will bring those up at the end and in the discussion. Take it away.
So like UC said, I'm Meg, and with me is Bryan. In addition to our day jobs, we are, as part of those, members of the New Hampshire Human Trafficking Collaborative Task Force. I direct the task force as part of my role here at the coalition, and Bryan is a member of the core team doing a lot of work with outreach. Our hopes for today are initially, anytime we have a conversation about human trafficking, we like to establish, make sure we're all on the same page about what we're talking about. There are so many myths and misconceptions out in the general public that we like to make sure that we have a shared understanding going into our conversation of what human trafficking, how we define it, what the dynamics are, what it looks like. We'll talk about the approach to trafficking that New Hampshire is taking by the Human Trafficking Task Force, as well as our next steps. We've got some exciting developments coming up in our working task force as well. Just before we get into the nuts and bolts of trafficking, just a quick overview of our task force. We have our mission statement, as you can see. We're really focused on having a collaborative, multidisciplinary approach to trafficking in the state. Taking advantage of our small state, it's really helpful to be able to get all the people in the same room that need to be talking about these cases, from prevention to response and outreach and prosecution. So the task force is coordinated here at the New Hampshire Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence. The members of the core group of the task force that really engage in the work we have one full-time and one part-time funded law enforcement officer. They're from New Hampshire State Police and Stratford County Sheriff's Office, but are detailed to Homeland Security investigations for their task force work. So they have jurisdiction around the whole state. The New Hampshire Attorney General's Office, prosecutors at both the county and federal levels, and state, obviously, other law enforcement, victim services professionals, healthcare, and children's services. So that's the core team of the task force that really coordinates on cases and the direct response. We also have an advisory committee of the task force that meets quarterly, really just to get any stakeholders involved in the response and state connected, so that they can share resources, share what they're doing, and kind of be aware of each other's work to collaborate. The core, part of that core mission statement for the task force is ensuring that in the process of addressing human trafficking, that we're ensuring that our work is victim-centered and trauma-informed. So we're always really placing that victim care at the center of what we're doing for all of those professions, and ensuring that we're first and foremost ensuring that victims and stability for their own lives.
So still a moment on the collaborative task force idea. The reality is that in order to navigate a crime that is specifically affecting people who are both victims and often have a crime as well, there needs to be a mode of operation to really create a victim-centered and trauma-informed way of addressing the crime. Human trafficking is an issue that has been hidden in the midst of so many different situations that we need the community and the various services to work collectively together and understand one another's roles in the process. And so as you can see, right from the get-go, the intention is collaboration between various organizations and services. Basic definition of human trafficking. Human trafficking really is a human rights violation. It's a crime of overcoming a victim's will, an individual's will, through a form of force or fraud or coercion, and compelling them to engage in some kind of traditional labor, domestic servitude, or commercial sex exploitation. And that terminology, that reality of force and fraud and coercion has become an important element in the definition of human trafficking. The traffickers use various forms of force, fraud, and coercion to control and exploit victims. It could include imposing a debt. It could include fraudulent employment opportunities, false promises. It could include psychological coercion. It could include violence or threats of violence. And I think that it's really important to understand that traffickers and their victims can be any age, any race, any ethnicity, any sex, under any gender identity, nationality, immigration status, cultural or socioeconomic background, even any education level. And traffickers can be relatives, they can be friends, they can be operating alone or as part of a criminal organization. And so some trafficking occurs entirely within the United States, and others means having victims moving across borders, unaware even that they would become trafficking victims.
I see a question. I think, several folks may be wondering this from the New Hampshire Office of the Child Advocate. How would an organization join the Coalition Task Force?
You can reach out to me. We have a memorandum of understanding with our advisory committee members, and we are happy to expand that to relevant interested stakeholders. So I have my contact information at the end of the PowerPoint. And actually, I don't know if you, or Bailey, are able, you can put my email in the chat if that would work. Thank you. But yeah, I'd be happy to connect with people individually. A little bit more information about our New Hampshire statute. So the language that Bryan was explaining, the force, fraud, and coercion as that means of exerting the power and control, that really comes from the federal statute. In the New Hampshire statute, we use the language to compel, but effectively they work the same way. So force, fraud, and coercion are just a little bit more descriptive, and they're really still helpful for us in considering those different means. A couple things I want to highlight about our New Hampshire statute. We do have explicitly in our statute that facilitating or controlling someone's access to a substance meets that definition of compelling someone, which is really helpful, as you can imagine, in the context of our state, to have that spelled out explicitly in the statute. The other thing that's really important to note, and this is federally as well, is that anyone under 18 cannot consent to commercial sexual activity. So whereas someone who's 16 can consent to sex in general, they cannot consent when there's a commercial element involved. So, if we're looking at a 17-year-old who's engaged in sex work, we are completely looking at that person as a victim, regardless of what they feel themselves about their intentionality or their own consent. We're treating that person as a victim. There would be no prosecution of the victim, and regardless of whether or not we're able to identify any trafficker or anyone else who's been involved that we can prosecute, that would be someone we've been entirely treating as a victim.
Some key points about trafficking. I think a lot of times when you imagine, you might have seen movies like Taken, or you might see kind of in some ways manipulative videos or images on social media that seem to display someone locked up, someone in a really depressing and oppressive environment. And the reality is that payment of a wage or a salary doesn't preclude exploitation. An initial consent doesn't mean that someone isn't being trafficked. Again, we're looking back at those elements of force, fraud, and coercion, and there's an element of oftentimes someone comes into the situation of human trafficking where maybe they thought that they were taking on a good opportunity. Maybe they thought that they were building a partnership, and then the tables turn, and it turns out that they're kind of stuck in a place of manipulation. There doesn't have to be movement, travel, or kidnapping required. There are cases around the globe where that happens, but that's not necessarily the general norm within a game. So restraints and confinement are not required. It could be an emotional codependency that is part of holding someone in. And we'll look at more of the barriers that people have for why don't they leave a little later in the presentation. There's a few different cases. This first year in 2002, I believe it was, the second case of labor trafficking that was prosecuted in the United States took place in New Hampshire on a tree farm in Litchfield. And it was a situation where the company had legally brought in H-1B visa workers to work on their tree farm. And they were given a small trailer with without any air conditioning and running water working. At a certain point, they had their passports and papers removed. They had no ability to leave the space without being targeted for being a potentially illegal immigrant. And they, at a certain point, one of the members of the workforce was injured and they weren't even allowed to go to the hospital. The person had to climb out the back of the window and get to the hospital. And that opened up the case where this company had been exploiting these workers from Jamaica. Another situation, I'm sitting here in Durham, New Hampshire, and when in 2011, 2012, when the cottages, luxury housing apartments were being built, there was a situation where a group of Guatemalan workers had been promised a living wage, promised a good living situation, and had their wages withheld for over 6 months, had their passports and documents withheld for that period of time. And there was a march around Durham, and it was a situation where the contractor had subcontracted out workers to complete the job to keep it moving along, and that subcontractor was exploiting the workers, and that was prosecuted as a labor violation. But also the Attorney General's office helped a couple of the Guatemalan workers to get specific T visas that are only eligible if you've been trafficked. And so that was a case of a labor violation that was also an element of trafficking.
So that's a helpful kind of example of the types of industries that we see labor trafficking in New Hampshire. Our tourism industry is a real big one, as well as, like Bryan mentioned earlier, construction, landscaping, things like that. We also see the illicit massage businesses, which we can, kind of look at as both labor. And those are really organized businesses that can pop up in different places and are pretty agile. So we're able to look at those through another lens, really. As far as our sex trafficking, which, we do see more cases of sex trafficking in New Hampshire than labor, although we do see both. Our most recent prosecutions, we sentenced both Tyler Townsend and John Murray this year federally. So you may be familiar with these cases. Tyler Townsend was based out of Dover. He had a 17-year-old girlfriend, as far as she was concerned. He was her boyfriend. He was very abusive and was able to use that relationship to advertise her on Backpage and basically sell her services. That case came in via ACYF, who did a lot of work with the victim and were able to support her as well through that process. And for that this year, the other case, he was sentenced. The other case, John Murray recently, the manager at West Alton Marina in Alton Bay, had teen boy employees working for him and was soliciting them for photos and videos as well as sex acts. So he was convicted as well. That came in via a parent of a victim, and then once people started talking, it turned out that that was really an open secret in the community, and a lot of victims were identified. So that was a case that ended up being investigated, not just in New Hampshire, but around the country and even abroad, to really build that case. So he was sentenced this year as well to, other charges along with those trafficking charges. Both of those cases, I think, are really helpful to look at the different ways that trafficking comes in to the task force and to our investigators. Is a huge kind of identifier for us. In our last calendar year, UIF identified 95 cases that they screened as potential trafficking cases and then looked at. One of our task force members is the human trafficking specialist at UCYF, which is the specific role that they have now, which is fantastic, so that they can really look at those cases through that lens as well. The Murray case, that was a parent of a victim, so kind of a self-reporting. There were community members involved as well. We do get a lot of cases that are identified via healthcare. That can be a huge touch point for victims. That a lot of the times our healthcare workers can identify some of the telltale injuries or signs, as well as, whether there's been a lack of care going on there. There's also our crisis centers. So we see a lot of times victims who are other victimizations and then start to realize through working with a crisis center advocate that that trafficking was part of their experience as well. Bryan's going to talk about this slide a little bit, but I just wanted to quickly, sorry, Bryan, just before you jump into it. The reason that I put Maslow's hierarchy on here is because I was doing a training at one point with a law enforcement officer who mentioned that when he arrested a trafficker, the trafficker had Maslow's hierarchy on his phone. And so I think that was just it's jarring, and it's a really helpful illustration of the intentionality that often goes into recruiting victims. And
Meg, I'm sorry, what did he have on his phone?
So Maslow's hierarchy of needs, I'm sorry.
No, but he had Maslow's hierarchy of needs on his phone?
He had it on his phone, just like as a tool for basically like, where does this person I've identified fall on here? Yeah, so being able to look, because we all have needs. So it's, does this person need shelter? Do they need food? Do they need love and belonging? I think of that a lot of the time with our LGBTQIA+ youth, especially, who, may be looking for someone to validate them, maybe looking for a sense of community, especially if their family is not supportive. So there's, it's so easy to identify, needs, particularly for vulnerable populations. And so traffickers, we talked about this a little bit before, but traffickers may be very intentional, especially if it's kind of a career trafficker. There may also be people, in our more community-based and familial situations where there's an opportunity and it's easy to exploit, but that intentionality is there and those needs are always there. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's a case that took place at Emory University. We're not talking about a New Hampshire situation, but I use this illustration often because I'm working around college students, and it was a situation where a young woman was out at a party, a club, met a gentleman, danced together, had a fun night together, and he just let her know, hey, I am working on a video shoot and I'm looking for some extras for the project. Here's my business card if you'd like to join me. I think that you are beautiful and electric and you'd be great on camera. And it's a pretty limited opportunity, so don't let too many people know about it, but I'd love to meet with you if you're interested. This woman went, back to her dorm, gave it a thought, eventually called this gentleman based on the number on his business card. They got together at a coffee shop and, went through the hiring process, got her W-4 together, which gave the individual her background information. And then when she went, the video shoot was supposedly at a warehouse a ways off campus, a little off the beaten path. And when she went to do the shoot, she was given a drink, drugged, and at that point coerced into a life of trafficking where the trafficker said, look, I know where you live. I know you have a 2-year-old brother. I'm going to, if you try to turn me in, if you try to get out of this, I'm going to hurt them, hurt you. And so for over a year, this student was the victim of this trafficker at nights and weekends. And it wasn't until the trafficker tried to do the same thing to another student that reached out and to law enforcement, and the ring was busted. But the reality that trafficking can happen to anyone is challenging. And because traffickers know how to identify and exploit vulnerability. Traffickers are intentional, they can be calculated, they know what to look for to understand needs and interests and desires. They know where to look and how to target someone, how to maybe groom someone who they perceive needs to be, they bring themselves into a situation where they are the solution to a felt need. Another example, and this was one of our own student volunteers at the Freedom Cafe who learned how to identify signs, learned how to ask some good questions, was visiting her sisters, who was a freshman at Boston University. And the same kind of scenario had played out where the roommate had connected with someone really early on as a freshman. And this gentleman was inviting her to leave school and go to Iowa. And the roommate was kind of head over heels for this person and felt like this was going to be a better life for her. She was uncomfortable, wasn't sure that she was in the right major, wasn't sure that she was in the right school, didn't know how she was going to be able to afford it. And this person was giving her an opportunity. And it was only because the student volunteer, Ginny, who had been working with us here at the cafe, began to ask, tell me more about the business. Tell me more about the family that you're being invited to go and live with in Iowa. And at that point, the person who was targeting this young woman cut and ran. We'll never know if this was potential trafficking case, but having the tools and the right questions and to support the people in our community is essential. Say traffickers try to isolate you. They try to alienate you from friends and family to create increasing dependency, emotional and economic dependency on the trafficker. And they strengthen that through force and fraud and coercion. So there was a presentation a few years ago at the Department of Education, and I think this quote, I don't know the person who quoted it, but I always put it out in a presentation that this person had been a victim of trafficking. He understood the ability of traffickers to know vulnerability, and he shared, until our communities, until our community organizations, until our neighborhoods, until our schools, until our social services are able to equally identify vulnerabilities and wrap a protective arm of support around, we'll never address fully trafficking. And so my hope is that, as we come away from this moment, we think a little bit more about how do we as a community meet the needs of the people around us so that we are not leaving them vulnerable to a trafficker.
So many upstream conditions, right, to create those situations of vulnerability. I want to acknowledge Suzanne's question about options that school districts have to educate staff, support them to identify possible cases. We also have a community resource center on the call. If others want to put their affiliations, we can try to address your unique perspective as well. But I know you'll be shifting to sort of the trainings and an identification and some actionable steps for attendees also, which is great.
Yeah, I will say that we do, as a task force, training is one of our priorities, and we do offer free trainings for pretty much anyone that will have us. So we did last year in the springtime. I went along with my colleague from GCYF from the task force, and we presented for the state meeting of the McKinney-Vento liaisons for the schools around the state. We've done a presentation for guidance counselors. So, really just trying to support that awareness for school staff and those youth-facing professions, as well as our colleagues from the Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force, which is also a really helpful resource for especially people working with you to talk about some of that online safety as well.
I would also say that in terms of our experience with the task force, we've found it often difficult to get into school systems. I think that it has been, there's so much that needs to be covered in it. And yet, if we have the ability to do more training, a couple of successful trainings within the school system can help lead to new opportunities across. So if you're interested, I think if Susan was asking the question, if you're interested in working with us, it'd be a great opportunity to begin to build trust with respect to the task force across the state and to serve and support us.
I would say too that I think, having the task force based as the coalition is a really helpful way of putting human trafficking, rather than kind of off in a silo within the context of the next domestic and sexual violence, where it really does fall within that scope of power and control. So, each of our crisis centers around the state are in many of the schools providing prevention education and looking at those dynamics of healthy relationships and, personal boundaries and consent and all of that, which is really the building blocks for children of being able to have that autonomy, know who the safe adults are to talk to. So that's incorporated into what our crisis centers are working on.
Kind of ad hoc, but thinking about labor trafficking in the state and just labor violations in general, we've seen in the Department of Labor cases in the North Country where young students just graduating high school are getting a job in construction, and they've been told by their employer, you're going to work for $10 an hour and we're not going to pay you overtime, and if you say anything, I'm going to make sure that no one else hires you. This is not human trafficking, this is a labor violation. And yeah, I don't think there's really a scenario in high school where kids aren't taught their rights as an employee. And I could imagine that being something that gets incorporated into what does it look like to get into the workforce, and what are your rights, what are the wage laws and labor laws in our state that you can feel comfortable asking for, and getting help if you're not getting that.
And the U.S. Department of Labor is an active member in our task force, as well as the New Hampshire Department of Labor, and they do have some great materials around that. So I'm happy to, if anyone wants to be connected with their outreach folks, I'm happy to make that connection if you want to reach out. Did you have anything else on this slide that you wanted to talk to, Bryan, or should I move to the next slide?
Yeah, feel free to jump in.
So we know already, Bryan, but we know that human trafficking, again, can affect anybody, but there are certain groups that face increased vulnerabilities. So, we know that youth who run away or go missing are at a really high risk of being approached by someone with an exploitative opportunity or proposition. Obviously, having a lack of financial materials makes someone vulnerable to seeking opportunities that may be exploitative. People who may have physical or intellectual disabilities, anyone who relies on a carer, that's an easy relationship for someone to exploit. So, you can, we dive deeper into this in other trainings, but for now, just, bearing in mind that while it does affect anyone, and we see victims from all different groups and communities, past trauma and other specific circumstances are specific vulnerabilities. As far as reasons that it may be difficult for someone to leave a situation, I think this is really important to highlight. It's very similar to domestic violence, where it's easy for people on the outside to say, just leave the situation. It's a bad situation, just walk away. And a lot of the reasons that it is difficult for victims to do that are similar, but there are some specific ones as well. So, the violence and threats is going to mirror domestic violence, and that might be physical violence. More often it's psychological threats and that coercion. Again, similar to domestic violence, having a lack of alternatives. If a trafficker is providing shelter for someone and they don't have another safe place to go, then that is going to be a barrier to leaving that situation. The isolation, distrust, and dependency, that's something that's been intentionally created by the trafficker, right? So they've tried to isolate their victim, burn some of those bridges with community support for family members, potentially. Self-blame and hopelessness. A lot of the times traffickers are making it clear to victims that the victim has created the problem itself, whether that's through addiction, whether it's through criminal activities that may be related to the trafficking. We don't prosecute victims for non-violent crimes that happen in the course of their trafficking, but victims don't necessarily know that. And traffickers, it's very easy to say, look, if you go to the police, you're the one going to jail, right? You've been engaged in prostitution, or you've been shoplifting, or you've been dealing drugs. So there is that sense of self-blame and that sense of being criminalized. The lack of safety may come from not having a safe place to stay. It also may come from knowing that trafficker has a lot of investment in that person as a commodity and is likely to want to track them down, may have associates trying to track them down. Lack of social support. this kind of comes from those victim blaming attitudes, and also just from as a society, and the trafficker being able to successfully isolate that victim to the point where they don't feel like they would be a credible person if they go to report, maybe because of just other conditions that they may have also burnt bridges with family members and friends. The biggest one I feel like is misidentification. So as a society, if we don't really have a good understanding of what human trafficking actually is, then it's really hard to expect that a victim have a comprehensive understanding of that to the point where they can go and say, could you please help me? I've been a trafficking. So that's why so many of these cases are coming in via DCYF flagging it, via a healthcare professional flagging it, via a crisis center advocate who has been working with a domestic violence victim and then gradually realizes that there is a commercial element to that abuse and that person has also been trafficked. So I think that's a huge barrier, is just being able to name it and identify it as a society and a community and as a victim. So I think that's where we can do a lot of work as well. And that's where I think our crisis center advocates are so crucial in being able to support someone in that process of understanding kind of more of the complexity and the nuance of their victimization.
As we've already talked about, we've seen cases of labor trafficking and commercial sex exploitation in New Hampshire. And the reality is that in all 10 counties, in urban and rural settings, there are survivors of all backgrounds across the state. And so it is not something that happens out there. It's something that is happening here in our communities, something that we need to address in our state. It's local. Again, there's an element of sensationalism that takes place in so many of the film, so much of the social media surrounding the issue of human trafficking. And films like this make it harder for us to really understand how trafficking is happening. Again, Meg just talked about misidentification, and because our media is building, kind of this sense of what do we want to do? We want to be like an FBI agent or someone going out and rescuing victims. The reality is that that's in most cases going to be causing more harm than good, even for the victim, because the victim is being exploited. And we want to see victims come forward of their own volition to have the opportunity to process their trauma. So I guess the hope with training like this is for us to begin to understand and think about how we can incorporate our human trafficking into our everyday jobs and into our everyday work. And that's where we're going to start moving this presentation. And how do we begin to incorporate?
So just before we kind of go into the task force work, a few of the trends that we're seeing kind of most recently in New Hampshire, familial trafficking. So, I think this is also linked to our opioid crisis issues. It's really easy for a child to be groomed by a family member, especially when you start from a young age. So that's that child's normal. So children are really easy victims for trafficking situations. And I think these are the situations where it's not as intentional as some of those career traffickers, but there is an opportunity for someone who's in a desperate situation to exploit that situation and sadly exploit a child in their own household. The other thing that we've seen recently in the task force is a co-occurrence of domestic violence and trafficking, and in particular, the use of online platforms to traffic a domestic violence victim. So, specifically OnlyFans, things like that. We've seen a few of these cases, but I expect that there's a lot more. So it's definitely something that we're trying to flag for professionals that we work with as something to be mindful of when they're working with the DV victim. That power and control is already established in that domestic violence relationship. So it's really easy for that abusive partner to then also move into a role of being a trafficker, some extra money. So the current response of the task force, the work that we do right now on our task force, case coordination is a big part of it with our prosecutors, our law enforcement, our children's services workers, victim services. We're all kind of collaborating on these cases. Usually we're all on the phone to one another just to support with, whether it's finding a hotel for the night in an emergent situation, connecting with victim services in different places if someone needs to move throughout the state. And then obviously law enforcement and prosecution are doing their own coordination on cases that investigation moves. Our law enforcement officers they will do kind of any level of the investigation, based on what the local jurisdiction needs and wants. So they don't just kind of come in and steal a case, but they will provide training and technical assistance. They have a lot of resources to support with investigations and to really, provide any mentorship necessary to local law enforcement as they learn about how to deal with these cases. We have links to victim services so that we can support with finding those resources and referrals for all of that wraparound care that victims may need. We do trainings, as we've talked about. Protocol development is one that we're really excited about. So in New Hampshire, many of you may be familiar with the Attorney General's protocols on sexual assault, domestic violence, child abuse and neglect, elder abuse. So the task force has had a project over the last several years that we are nearly completed to put together a multidisciplinary response to human trafficking that the Attorney General's office will publish. So it will be on the level with those other protocols. So we're really excited to be able to promote that understanding of human trafficking within our professional community in the state, and to then use that as a training tool for the various disciplines. And then throughout all of that, really, we are centering our principles of making sure that all of this work is victim-centered and trauma-informed. So, every time that our law enforcement officers are providing training for the police academy, or anytime we're providing training for healthcare workers, we are always making sure that we're talking about being victim-centered, and we're not just going out and trying to wrap up prosecution to get statistics. We are looking at these cases and making sure that the victim is safe as we move forward. And if they're safe and stable, they're going to be more likely to be able and willing to participate in a prosecution, which would be great. But first and foremost is their safety and stability. So I've talked about that. Non-prosecution of victims, I touched on briefly earlier, but that is part of our state statute as well. We know that oftentimes victims of trafficking either are forced by the trafficker to participate in criminal activity, or it's a need. If they're being sheltered and controlled, and all of their movements controlled by a trafficker, and no food is provided, they may need to shoplift to eat. So we're not prosecuting victims for those types of offenses. And our crisis centers around the state are supporting trafficking victims. So I think that as a coalition and as our crisis centers, we are known as domestic and sexual violence, but we are also serving victims of human trafficking. For labor trafficking, we definitely encourage victims to come in and we can support them. The only thing that we can't provide is we do have that statutory privilege for victims of sexual offenses, which we don't have for labor trafficking victims if there's been no sexual component, but we can still speak to them as privately as possible and connect them with resources. We just can't guarantee that privilege. But the crisis centers around the state are really doing a great job of getting up to speed with understanding trafficking and the dynamics. So that's our first port of call, really, for when we're connecting law enforcement with a cabinet victim that they are looking to get all those resources. Our updates for the task force that are really exciting. We have been funded by federal grants since 2016, and as of July, we are in the state budget now. We did a lot of advocacy with the Attorney General's office last year, and the Attorney General and the Governor agreed to the task force funding under the DOJ budget. So we've got level funding currently, but they've been really open to, seeing what more we could do within the state and how we could do it better. So part of that funding has included a needs assessment, which will be starting in December, which will be conducted by an outside organization. That will be a 12-month process, talking to lots of stakeholders, doing interviews and all of that. And, and then seeing from that where we can allocate more funding and more resources. So we're really excited for that, partly just that we won't be having to apply for those federal grants every 3 years. And hopefully this is also going to help to, get more state level stakeholders involved and raise awareness in the state and really have our state kind of take ownership of this project. Most of the task forces that I kind of have been in contact with around the country are still federally grant funded, so this is really exciting. Here's some contacts. I think that's the end of our kind of very, very quick and concentrated overview of trafficking in New Hampshire and the trafficking task force. So I know that it's like a very kind of abbreviated version. So please feel free, whatever questions you may have. And also feel free, please, to reach out to me. I'm more than happy to continue discussions offline.
Thank you so much, Meg and Bryan. I've learned so much and also found you both incredibly approachable about this. And so many people in different areas have been working so hard on this over a number of years. And yet there's still so much opportunity to share what the signs are, what the resources are, what this victim-centered and trauma-informed approach to something that is also breaking the law, right? On the other side of it, I encourage everyone to follow up in terms of converting these resources and supports to their own particular context. You know, it was striking to me that New Hampshire was one of the first states to move in this area, and really that the particular focus on human trafficking and the labor exploitation in particular are so new. You know, it's like when you look into human rights and the civil rights, is really how recent some of this motion is. And I wanted to ask, you know, it brings together the crime and violence and labor laws. What are the benefits of a unique focus on human trafficking rather than keeping it under the umbrella of these other related topics?
So, sorry, just to clarify, you mean as far as kind of a multidisciplinary approach, or as far as looking at kind of within domestic violence and power and control?
Yeah, I mean, there are two related areas here. One is as you pointed out, one is the specific identification of as something unique, something that requires its own naming and focus. And the other is sort of the reaction to that, which is bringing together this coalition of folks from different perspectives, from law enforcement, from social services, who might have different mindsets as well as tools in how to approach a crime and this victimization.
Yeah, it feels like it's kind of two sides of the coin, because it's really important to identify trafficking and to be really specific about it. But then from there, to place it within the context of our communities and make it not such a separate thing, right? So trafficking cases are often really complex for law enforcement and for anyone who's working with the victim, and for a few reasons. You know, one is that often these are victims who come with other traumas and very complex traumas, because that's what made them vulnerable to trafficking. So there's a lot of different pieces there. Often because of that trauma, the victims are really hard to work with. They're extremely traumatized. So they're not always forthcoming. They're not necessarily trusting. And so the cases can take a lot of time building rapport, building trust. And so that's a really important thing for law enforcement to develop skills and to be able to move those cases forward if those cases are going to move forward. The trafficking situations are complicated. They may be across many jurisdictions. They may be, you know, the commercial elements may be difficult to track down. We have to identify those commercial elements as well as the force, fraud, and coercion. So there's a lot of, you know, potential needing to track down different technology, Venmo and online activity, and, you know, emails and texts and Snapchat and all those platforms. So there's a lot of resourcing that goes into doing the complete investigation, as well as healthcare concerns that there may be, you know, whether it's labor trafficking victims who have been working extremely long hours without the appropriate protective equipment for dangerous work, or, you know, victims of sex trafficking who may have injuries related to that or infections related to that. So there's just a lot of complexity to the cases, which I think is really why it's very helpful to have a protocol, to have clear statutes, so that we can really define it and really create common language that we can use to go forward in these cases. In some ways, it's then a process of, I know that, you know, it can be for law enforcement or victim services professionals that it feels like, oh, this is this whole separate thing that I don't know how to deal with. I kind of know a little bit about trafficking, and that's really harder than what I'm doing. So it's, you know, for us with our victim advocates, saying these are the same skills that you already have. And this is part of what you're doing, and you already do have the skills for this, and it's just working with these victims. Maybe there may be a little bit more nuance, there may be a little bit more complexity to their needs, And we may have a few specific resources as well for them, which is always a nice thing. You know, there are some housing programs in New Hampshire and in the region that are specific to human trafficking victims. But sometimes identifying a trafficking situation also identifies some extra resources, which is always a really great thing. But it's really supporting people in understanding what to look for and also understanding that they can provide that support.
Helpful to know that moving from the federal statutes down, the intentionality behind building task forces within the state, funding through the federal grant, was oriented around building these relationships, breaking down these silos. It was understood that in order to address trafficking, we had to navigate the fact that law enforcement was seeking to find a criminal and get them indicted and prosecuted. That attorney generals, the attorneys are trying to have the conviction occur. And so there's various goals that these various departments have, that social services is always been more victim-centered, more trauma-informed. But how do we integrate those, learn to listen to one another and to one another about the needs and not victim blame along the way? Help people to recognize and navigate those complexities that Meg was talking about. And so to see those protocols kind of established across each state in the task forces, and then for us here in New Hampshire to have that begin to really be fully incorporated into our AG protocols for health and law enforcement and social services is very exciting. And I think that we are setting a trend across the country and creating a model that is going to be helpful for other states as well.
That's fantastic. Congratulations for the inclusion in the state budget that institutionalizes it in a way that not only provides more stability for your work, but also is a signal to, as you say, to others in the state that, that this is here to stay. I'm curious. Well, first of all, I know we have about 15 minutes left and want to encourage our attendees to drop any questions or comments in the chat. Also, again, if there are perspectives other than the Office of the Child Advocate and our school districts and community. I wonder about the needs assessment and if there are particular areas that you feel will be highlighted through that needs assessment that haven't been identified so far or haven't been prioritized.
Yeah, so one thing that we've been trying to get grant funding for the past few years and have not been successful is some specialized victim service professionals who can really work across the crisis centers to provide that direct training and TA to other advocates, as well as get actually involved in other cases outside their catchment area as needed. So I think that, having some more resources, we don't currently have any funding for dedicated trafficking advocates. So I think that's an area that we'd like to look at and consider, and maybe it would look exactly how we've envisioned it once we see the needs assessment. But I think ensuring that our victim services professionals feel like they're supported in addressing these cases will be a huge boost for supporting victims. And the other thing that, so we had our last 3-year grant, which just ended up being a 4-year grant. We had a no-cost extension because it basically encompassed the entirety of the COVID pandemic. So a lot of the things we were trying to do went a little bit sideways. But one of the things that was trickier during COVID and then was trickier during the no-cost extension was that outreach, really getting out to the community and raising awareness in the community, which obviously will reach victims and will also just reach. So I think that might be something that we'll be able to look at through the needs assessment. Ooh, and lastly, a lot of things I want to look at. Lastly, I think there's more data out there that we could be gathering and using and working with. So for the needs assessment to be able to do a statewide look and see where maybe we could get some more information to inform our work and our activities.
Right. It's interesting to hear, for example, the industries that are most prone to the labor exploitation and what sort of industry level supports, whether it's through associations or other types of business support, so that, you know, your mention of the Alton employer, where it was an open secret in the community. How do we develop more safeguards, even at a peer level of business owners in certain industries, so that that people feel morally and legally empowered to intervene in that way?
Yeah, I think that case is such a great example too, UC, because, it may be that a lot of those victims didn't quite know, it's that identification, especially if there was no actual physical contact. Like, am I being victimized if I'm trading a photo for money? I think that awareness of those dynamics potentially can help a lot in situations.
There's another, I was going to say there's another resource I think that is helpful in identifying the industries. We didn't speak specifically, though it's written here on the contact, the Polaris National Hotline for tips and help. And Polaris manages the national hotline, and they had the opportunity to really track and hear these tips from, hundreds of thousands of people over years. And they put together what they call the typology of modern slavery, and it specifically focuses on 25 different areas of industry that are known to be having more commercial exploitation at the time, from escort services and illicit places to all the way down to recreation, forestry, and lodging, construction, some of the things that we've talked about, hotel and hospitality. And these are the same areas that we are seeing trafficking occur and labor exploitation occur in the city of New Hampshire as well. So I think that tool is helpful in the link for those who want to.
Thank you, Bryan. Again, your voice is fading in and out, but as you say, the Polaris Project, looking at particular industries that are where it's more likely to be found. It's important. I'm curious also about, with COVID and also the role of technology and the internet. It seems like it is, on one hand, the opportunity for exploitation is so much larger with the internet's scope, and also that it can be much harder to find or to track, since it can all be done within one's own home with a camera. Where do you expect the growth of internet-related sexual exploitation to be handled within New Hampshire and more broadly?
Yeah, and so, I mentioned the ICAC task force earlier, and they receive tips whenever it's related to children in New Hampshire. So that's really helpful. As far as adults, it's a lot harder, because it's really hard to identify what is consensual, willing use of those platforms and what's not. So I think that's, again, where some of that community outreach and education of helping people to understand that they shouldn't have to be forced to do these things. Working to ensure that healthcare providers, mental health providers, victim service providers are able to sometimes have those conversations where there's a handle education of something, as well as community awareness, because it is tricky. Yeah.
Right. And the community awareness, I mean, and maybe this is a way to wrap up, to come back to the individual in my own peer relationships, for someone who's not a professional working in this area, what would be the indicators to look for? And at what point is there any sort of downside to reaching out? What point do you think any signals would raise to the level of reaching out to the crisis hotline or to any of the other resources that you've shared?
I mean, I would certainly say you can reach out to the crisis hotline if you have a question. If it's kind of one of those things, like, if you have enough of a suspicion to wonder if you should call, then it probably makes sense to call, similar to our mandatory reporting for child abuse and neglect, right? So, and they're always happy to just talk through that with you. Indicators are really tricky, and we do, in some of our presentations we put them up, but there are a lot of long lists for a lot of different scenarios. So, but I think that a change in online activity, kind of more of an attachment to that online activity or that phone within the context of other behaviors, though, of course, but really, if we're talking about our peer relationships, it's just about noticing some of those changes and being able to be someone who can listen and validate to start with, because, the foremost thing is for people to have someone that they feel like they could trust. Not that you need to take on the advocacy yourself as a peer, as a friend or family member, but being able to say, there are resources, and validating the experience, and then pointing to a crisis center. Or if someone wants to go directly to law enforcement, that's fine too. Or if they feel more comfortable talking to someone else first, a therapist or a doctor. But I think starting by feeling validated and believed is always a good first step.
And being able to say with certainty that New Hampshire, as it is not blaming the victim, is really focusing on victim support. And I apologize, Amy had written in the chat a question that I had as well, speaking with you today as well as previously. This line of work sounds very difficult and has the potential for secondary trauma for staff. How does your organization cope with the emotional burden and stress associated with this type of work?
Yeah, that's a really awesome question. And, I know as Coalition and Crisis Centers, we try to make sure that we do a lot of work around self-care, a lot of debriefing, a lot of support for one another. We try to encourage that in our allied professions. Obviously, it's really hard for us to say to nurses or to law enforcement professionals, like, you need the self-care, but, I hope that by modeling that and then being part of a multidisciplinary task force where we can talk about that with one another, that will start to go out into those other professions that may be struggling with that, because it is a lot. I see I see the law enforcement officers that are having to lift their officers with all of that. I think encouraging awareness of that, vicarious trauma, and trying to provide help for support.
Speak broad generalization, but something that's really been on my mind is, I'm coming at this from being a social business, not a social worker. And the more that I have heard the stories, witnessed the experiences of survivors of trafficking, worked with social workers in this process, yes, there is a lot of stress associated. And I think alongside that stress is the reality that most of our social workers are underpaid, that most of the people who are doing immense emotional work to support our societies and our communities are not paid enough that they can have the resources to do some of those getaways, to do some of those recreational activities that might really serve to rebuild and restore their emotional life, to do the work that they're doing. And so I don't know where this goes, but for my part, as a social business, I've been thinking a lot about how do we change our cultural perspective to better fund our social service agencies, because they are doing the hard work of supporting victims, helping these people towards health and engagement with the world.
That's absolutely right, Bryan. And in the preventative work also.
Exactly.
Carsey's work in the in vulnerable youth and families, in the work on social policy and practice, in the even in looking at global conflict and human security. What can we do to avoid the environments that and the conditions that make this type of victimization at the individual level, and also sort of the infrastructure, the social infrastructure, make it much harder for these situations to happen. I really appreciate both of your time joining us today, and of course the work over many, many years that you both have put into this. Derek has said, thank you for putting this on. And I think I speak for all of our attendees, and that we've learned more about this, a situation that might not be visible and yet is so present across New Hampshire and the world. So we'll put your presentation up on our website, and folks have Meg's contact information to get involved with the coalition or other activities in this area.